think what I'm always most interested in is how we as individuals interface with the world through our perception.
Hi everyone, welcome to ARTXCODE Studio Visits, where we dive into the minds of creatives shaping the generative art landscape. I'm Toni Marinara, and today I'm thrilled to sit down with the man of the hour, Mr. Lars Wander, a New York City-based artist and software engineer. Lars takes an entirely code-based approach to creating art focused on capturing surprising moments from computers. How you doing, Lars?
Doing really well. Very happy to be here.
It's great to see you. So we'll dive into the first question. We'll just get right into it. Given the technical nature of your work, a lot of interviews that I've seen done with you have been really focused on like how you create and haven't really dug into the why. Why did you become an artist? What are your inspirations behind your work that really drive it? And I noticed that on your website, your bio mentions that you're writing code to explore ideas best handled by computers. But I think there's something really human in your work. At least that touches me on a human level, and I'd love to hear you elaborate on those ideas and what sparks these explorations. Where do they come
I like that you mentioned that my work has a human element. I feel like I say on the website that I want to explore ideas that are best handled by computers, and that's totally true. But I think the ideas fundamentally, I think, have a very human component. I think what I'm always most interested in is how we as individuals interface with the world through our perception. Growing up, I think one of my favorite things was discovering optical illusions, and they sort of tore down the veil a little bit, showing that our interpretation of reality is not perfect and it's a subjective experience. When it comes to ideas that are best handled by computers, I think during my undergrad, I took a few classes that really focused on the intersection between computation and math. And what I really found interesting there were machine-assisted proofs, where we used programming languages that are really designed to help you write proofs, and use techniques that really leverage the raw computational power that our computers offer us to find answers to problems that would be virtually impossible to do by hand. And that sort of really opened my eyes to the fact that computers were these very powerful tools. I think before that, I'd really seen them as a vessel for video chatting, gaming.
That's amazing. Yeah. I noticed that you're a big fan of photography and talking about perception and how we perceive things, how the lens does, right? When I first met you, you had told me that during COVID, you took to the streets of New York and you were exploring street photography. I don't know if my timeline's exactly right, but it seems like around that time, you had just also began really diving into creative programming, creative coding as an art form. So, was it photography that helped unlock your desire to pursue art? And if it was, without that outlet, do you think you would have been led through your work as a programmer to art?
Street photography actually absolutely shaped my practice and my current understanding of art. So I discovered street photography a little bit before COVID, I think in 2018. Became really fascinated with really just the idea of walking around the city and trying to capture interesting moments. And I think before that, and before the range of photographers that it opened me up to, I really had this idea that art was primarily about aesthetic appeal and beauty. And of course, that's a large component to art, no matter how you slice it. But I think one artist that really stuck out to me there was Daniel Arnold, who creates these photos that I think at first glance look very grungy, and they look kind of disordered, and they don't really have like the kind of aesthetic appeal that you would think of finding in, say, like a hotel lobby or something that is hung up just to look good. But his pieces sort of tap into something deeper and something more emotional. And looking at them, you are sort of left in disbelief, wondering, like, is this a real moment that he found? How on earth did he capture this? And then also, there's something kind of very playful and maybe flirty, maybe unconventional in the shots that he chooses that I think really reward spending a little bit of time looking at them. And I think realizing that art was more about just capturing something beautiful and maybe more about telling a story was really very compelling to me. And I think that that opened my eyes to what art could really be about. Yeah.
I feel like photography and generative art, I mean, there are a lot of parallels, but something a striking difference, I guess, for and especially to you, where you were exploring photography, street photography in particular, where you're just out on the road and you don't really have control of those surroundings. You're not on a set, you're not telling the models what to do or arranging the props in a certain way. But with generative art, you're telling the computer what to do. You are really in the driver's seat, less of an observer and more of the composer of the situation. How did that feel, going from one medium to the other, that to me at least seems so different? And correct me if I'm wrong, if there is a more of a cohesive manner to making both art forms.
In photography and in generative art, you can kind of pick how much you're an observer, like you put it, or a composer, like you said. If you're trying to capture a chaotic moment in New York City, really the best you can do is hope that you're in the right place and right time. It's totally true that with generative art and computer-based art, that you can, if you want, completely dial up the control all the way and be very explicit in how you place things and how you arrange things. But you can also dial that back. And I think this is particularly true because randomness plays such an important role in generative art, as it does, I guess, in street photography too. That one of the levers that you have is really how much control you hand over to the computer. And I think what's particularly interesting and something that I feel like I try to focus on a lot is that randomness is not the only way to dial that control back and forth. And there's all sorts of ways you can have surprising moments in generative art in a system that's completely non-random, it's completely deterministic, doesn't even use a pseudo-random function, so there's nothing in there about trying to create something that looks like randomness, but you can still create surprise. And I find the existence of that to be very unique and very interesting, that you can take a process that you understand entirely, like you wrote every line of code, you know what steps it's going to take, you never make a call to a function where you don't know the value that you're going to get back. You know, at least in theory, every step it's going to take. But still, in the end, you look at it and you go, wow, I never would have thought that that's what would happen here. And I think that to me, I think it's maybe saying something deeper about the way the universe works and the way our minds work.
It's nice to know that, like, in the age of the computer, where everything is so controlled, that there is still this element of surprise that we do find, outside in the world.
In a sense, you can't outthink a computer in terms of how fast it can carry out operations. So when you start to write and run systems that do things that are on a small scale very predictable, but on a large scale very unpredictable, you sort of run into one of the fundamental things in the universe where you have emergent properties come out of small, local, understandable operations. And as a slight aside, I feel like this is kind of one of the most interesting things that's still trying to be understood about the universe, and it's still a giant mystery. Like, how do these emergent properties arise? Why do they arise? What causes them to take on the properties that they do? And why are we so effective, or not why are we so effective, but why is it so possible to model these emergent phenomena without knowing anything about them? That's kind of very bizarre and very strange to sort of meditate on, and something I recommend if you find it interesting to think about a little bit, because it's very perplexing and very rewarding.
Speaking further on photography, next week, this show might be on by the time we put this out. You'll be heading off to Europe for Paris Photo. And I've heard you say in other interviews, and we spoke earlier a little bit about him, that Saul Leiter was a big inspiration for you, the photographer. I just read last night actually that last year Paris Photo honored him for his 100th birthday and his work was exhibited. You entered the generative art scene, I'd say, in 2021, right? Like, that's fair to say, maybe in a public manner. And since then, you've had, quite a few amazing projects that have had great success. But 3 years is a really short time to, I think, establish a career, a foothold in a medium, and you've done an amazing job of that. So, you know, from smaller explorations on FX Hash, now just a few years later, you're at Paris Photo, which is an amazing accomplishment, and congrats on that. But, how does that feel to be showing work at this more traditional, established art fair where one of your role models was just, their work was being exhibited last year?
Well, I think in one word, it's very surreal. But I think to uh, look back at my own trajectory, I really have to thank the work that you guys do at ARTXCODE to promote my work. I think that if you hadn't found me early on and given me the push that I needed, I don't think we'd be talking about going to Paris Photo in any form. But no, it's really amazing. I mean, Saul Leiter, he was sort of well known for photographing a pretty small area of New York in very vivid detail, and it's actually the neighborhood I was living in when I discovered street photography. So it was very fascinating to see the world through his eyes, maybe 50 years before I was shooting on those same streets, and see the same streets 50 years ago through the eyes of the brilliant Saul Leiter. And his work was deeply inspirational to me, and I feel like his ability to craft such painterly and abstract compositions with a camera, which is such like a literal tool for interpreting the universe, is really fascinating and deeply impressive. I think now getting to go to Paris Photo doesn't really feel real. I think I feel like I first learned about it when I dove into street photography and got like the giant Magnum contact sheets book and dove into all sorts of different legends of early street photography. And now getting to go and exhibit some of my own works, which granted are a very different form of photography. It's like a very abstract computational take on the idea of photography, is really amazing. And I'm really thankful for it.
It's going to be interesting to see. And I know generative art's been shown at Paris Photo before, but I'm looking forward to watching you interact with the fairgoers who are coming, for photography, and then finding generative art. Like, how do you think is a good way to introduce them to the medium and really draw that parallel with photography for to get to kind of open them up to what you do? Like, how would you describe that to someone who's coming from the outside and stumbles upon your work at the fair?
To be honest, I don't know if I can convert anyone. What is interesting though is this idea of taking photography and looking at fundamentally what it's doing, which is sort of capturing light on a sensor or on a piece of film, using that as an output, which is taking this mechanical or partially digital device and using it to capture reality, then recreating it entirely in code and capturing alternative realities. I find that so fascinating because the camera, just like our eyes and our brain, are made of the same stuff that they're observing. They're part of the same system. It's all one closed loop where a little slice of the universe observing itself, as Alan Watts would say. Here we are recreating that same phenomena, but entirely in code, where we have a little universe, if you will, which is following its own rules, doing its own take on physics, and then using something which is maybe as close to a camera as we can get in an environment like that, and using it to capture and tell us what it sees. I find that so fascinating that we can create these alternative worlds and then use a little bit of the physics that we know works in our universe.
It is amazing that you can do that. I was a terrible physics student, so I don't think I could ever do that. I love working with you and being able to see what you pull from that. I don't think that it's your duty, job at all to convert people to generative art. And when I just was trying to say, how you would explain it, which is you just gave a great one. But I do think that the work in itself, when people see it, especially this work that you will be showing and its nature of focusing on light, will definitely appeal to the photography fan. So that'll be really interesting. So let's dive into that collection actually. You'll be showing the work with Nguyen Wahed, with Mimi, which is actually very full circle because, for context, Lars's one of his first projects that he released, that the first project that I had the pleasure of working with Lars on was How You See Me. And we exhibited one of those for the first time with Mimi. That was really like your first, I think that was your first participation. It was online, but in an exhibition. So it's really nice to bring it home and do something with Mimi now.
Yeah, it's great on many levels. I mean, that show, I think it was Chromatics Part 2 on Verse, was showing works alongside Zach Lieberman, who's one of my longtime heroes, especially because his tooling, open frameworks, was sort of my first exposure to graphics programming. And I found his work beautiful long before I discovered generative art, even as a practice. I didn't know how he was making what he was making. Honestly, again, I feel so flattered and thankful that I have this opportunity.
It is beautiful. And Zach is definitely a legend, great person, amazing artist. And I'm grateful just to be able to interact with his work, let alone through you participate in an exhibition with him. So it's super cool. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the work. It's a new collection called Observation and Interaction. It is minted on Highlight. You just put it live the other day. And this is a study in the intersection between light, matter, and perception. And the works run live forever, which is pretty wild. And you've lovingly described them as handmade with vanilla JavaScript and GLSL. If you want to, give us a little bit of background on the work, when I first saw the work, it's very evident that it's a continuation of Light Doesn't Bend That Way, which was released a few years ago on Super Rare. How is this exploration different from that? And why did you choose, to keep pushing this work?
You're totally right. It's a continuation of Light Doesn't Bend That Way. That work also became sort of the basis for Full Spectrum, which was released in Tokyo by Bright Moments last year. I took that same code from the Bright Moments collection and basically kept pushing it and kept iterating on it to get to where we are now. And the sort of core idea that I've been very fascinated with, and I feel like is so bizarre and kind of beautiful, is that our modern understanding of physics tells us that in order to observe something, you fundamentally have to interact with it. And if you don't interact with something, so if you don't observe it, its behavior changes. The fact that this happens, I think, is maybe most famously told through Schrodinger's thought experiment with the cat in the box, sort of the bizarreness that comes out of the fact that you can have things that are in two states at once until you do something to actually observe it, which I feel like when I first heard about this, I think I was middle school or something, it felt so unusual and kind of like reality breaking to me because it seemed to imply that our ability to observe things, which seems like such a passive thing, can actually impact the universe. You would never think that by looking at something, you could change it. And that's not exactly what the physics is saying. I think the physics is saying more so that by shining the light on something, for example, to make it visible, you're interacting with it. And that in itself is inducing some sort of change in the object. But the fact that this duality, which seems like a duality, exists between observation and interaction is very bizarre and kind of very, very interesting. And so exploring it through the lens of ray tracing kind of felt like a very natural evolution for the work because fundamentally what you're doing there is you're observing something through the use of simulated light. In the case of a computer, you sort of don't really have to interact with the object at all. Shining the light is a very passive process. But if you think about what the computer is doing under the hood when it's running the simulation, in order to actually interact with and observe the thing that you're looking at, you have to do some physical things to the bits in memory. Like you are interacting with the object, even if, again, you think that your observation is entirely passive. It's not. It's an active process. And it's this very strange duality that arises there that I find just really fascinating and something that I want to explore deeper. Get the work to where it is today, and to have it run forever and live in the browser took a lot of work, optimizing it so that it could comfortably run on a variety of devices, and you can sort of pull it up and leave it sitting there and let it continue to run. Very interesting to me. I think that generative art allows us to explore and express systems in fundamentally different ways. I think the idea of an artwork that evolves continually and rapidly, something that's very interesting and something that I, at the start of the year, set a very conscious desire to explore throughout the year. So I think having live works, having works that evolve and change in front of the viewer, was a very conscious decision that I made that I wanted to explore. And that's where we got to where we are today.
Yeah. How long have you let one of these run live for? What's the longest?
On accident, for a few weeks, in a browser tab, it was a slightly earlier version of the code, so I think I can't say that this particular incarnation has run for weeks. But of course, to make sure that they do run forever, ran them for a few hours, monitoring all the memory usage and making sure there's no leaks that would eventually lead to a place where the browser crashes or the piece collapses. So they are stress tested, but there's theoretically no limit to how long they run for, and they will always be producing new outputs. And of course, that's a bit of a lie. Like there's a finite number of states that the computer can take on, and that finite is maybe a misnomer because it's an probably obnoxiously large number, one that we could never reach in our lifetime. So it's not really a concern about repetition there. But for all intents and purposes, it's infinite and it runs forever.
As far as we're concerned, it's forever.
Exactly.
When you first started out with these styles of work, like let's say light doesn't bend that way, you minted an image. Now you're uploading the code due to these advancements and minting technologies. How has that, or has it even, changed the way you approach your work?
It's a mix of the improvements in the minting technology. I think this fact that you can curate outputs, upload code, and then have both the code and the output that you care about and picked ahead of time live on chain, I think is, to me, I feel like sort of the ideal state for generative art. I think having that flexibility, being able to write code, and have that code exactly be the sort of the artifact that someone buys, not the image or not the video. I think to me like a very true expression of generative art, because fundamentally to me it's very much about the concept that the code embodies. And I think just an image doesn't describe the code. I think there's a million ways you can get to an image, but the code with that pre-curated output together are, I think, exactly the thing that I imagine that I'm handing over to a collector. So I'm really thankful that the technology for this exists. But I think at the time that Light Doesn't Bend That Way was released, the algorithm was also way too slow. Really had it be an enjoyable experience to run the code live. So I think there's sort of an aspect of not wanting to be wasteful in computational resources and not have people run inefficient renders just to see an output that I wanted to keep in mind too. So it's a mix of the improvements in the minting and also improvements in the algorithm.
I mean, you've been working on this for a long time. Over the last year, don't think you've minted a project since August of last year. Was it August of last year?
I think, yeah, August was Tonic, but I also did the Venice Bright
You did
Moments.
Venice, right? But that was a very small collection.
It was a very small collection and a sort of minor alteration to the full spectrum release. So.
Yeah, I just want to highlight that this work, it's not like you just picked up Light Doesn't Bend That Way and animated it. Like this has been the fruit of, many hours, months, over a year of pushing this code. So it's been really amazing to see that evolution. And I guess talking about some of the other experiments, things that I've seen you working on, and you're so amazing at sharing on Twitter, just what you're doing in your day, what kind of work you have in the background. And one of the things that I noticed after Venice was these tessellations. We were in Venice together for the Biennale, where Bright Moments was as well. And there were all these Venetian mosaics like everywhere. It's very characteristic of the city. And shortly after, you posted some beautiful mosaics, but then they started moving and evolving. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that work.
Like the vague idea of a project involving mosaics was sort of in my head for a little while before that, but it wasn't really until I got there that it really got me thinking. I had an idea of how I wanted to do a project like this, which at its core, the algorithm or the idea behind the algorithm is nothing new. It's something that's been used to generate mosaics in a mathematical sense and probably also in a cultural sense for a while now. And it's called recursive subdivision. Fundamentally, the way the algorithm works is you take a shape like a triangle and you define some rules about how to split that triangle into smaller shapes. For each shape you split it into, you also have some rules for how to split that into even smaller shapes, and you keep on doing that over and over again. And if you go far enough, you end up with something that looks very much like a mosaic. Seeing the variety of the shapes and thinking about this algorithm quite a bit, all of a sudden felt like things really clicked into place. And I feel like I was seeing these recursive subdivision rules everywhere, from the mosaics to the windows to the keyboard to my monitor. I don't know. I feel like everywhere I looked, it was seeing these patterns and seeing these substitution rules. I started working really intensely on trying to express those in code. And I think shortly after was getting some outputs that I was really happy with. And then I realized that with some careful coding and some heavy use of WebGL, which is like the interface for the GPU on web, these things could be made to run live. And I think this idea that you can spawn endless patterns starting from a single shape was really captivating to me. This interplay between the static nature of the rules, but then also the evolving nature of the piece, again, played back into that idea I was talking about earlier, this desire to produce long-running, evolving pieces, to me felt like a very natural idea to explore more deeply. This project is something that I've been working on pretty much nonstop since Venice, and getting into a state that I'm very excited about, very proud of, and hopefully can announce soon where it's going. I think I'm very excited about where it's going to end up. So it's a fun project and something that's a bit divorced from my previous works. I'm very excited about this project.
Yeah, definitely. And to clarify, this also runs live and can go to infinity.
Absolutely. In fact, to me, this project conceptually lives much closer to the idea of infinity, or at least the idea of unboundedness. I find that just so fascinating that you can take a concept which, in a sense, really can't exist, not a real thing. Nothing's really unbounded. Everything in the universe, as far as we know, is finite and limited. But again, finite is a bit of a misnomer because it can mean really, really, really big numbers. So finite is still really big. But this idea that you can take this impossible concept, infinity, something that really can't exist, we can't wrap our minds around, but you can express it through code, and you can express it formally through code, feels like so powerful. And it feels like it's really touching into something really important, fundamental about the universe. And I think that being able to, at the very least, scratch against those ideas in my artistic practice has really been a joy for me, and something that I hope I can share this sense of wonder and mystery and amazement with folks who collect my work.
I think you do that all the time. It's interesting, infinity, the universe, these are concepts that artists have been exploring for centuries, right? And, especially, I mean, if we talk about the universe and the heavens, that's a really big theme. And with generative art, you're really unlocking this mass potential to express it. And I think that, maybe when someone sees your work, that's not the first thing that comes to mind. It's not a painting of, you know, God, old man up in the sky, and Jesus and Mother Mary and the cosmos or the planets, the heavens. But you are saying something there about it. right? Exploring it, expressing curiosity about it, which is what those past works were too. So it's super interesting to see this be unlocked. This is relatively new, and to see where you can really go with it. And I wonder if it takes pulling out the context and by speaking about it like this, or writings, or if there are other people who will look at this objectively and think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think understanding the full concept behind a piece should never be a prerequisite to enjoying the piece, but I think it, at least to me, always adds something. So I feel like it's very much my job to try and explain what the motivations are behind these artworks. But if you're, whether you're a collector, or you are just observing these works, these concepts speak to you, and you want to dive deeper, then that gets me very excited and I want to talk to you. But by no means is having that idea in the back of your mind a necessity for enjoying or appreciating work. But I think it is, at least to me, what motivates me to keep working on it. I think if my job was only to make pretty pictures, I would have quit a long time ago, because it's not very inherently compelling, whether for me as like an observer of artwork or a creator of artwork. I think it's much more interesting when there's something deeper and more meaningful behind the works. And I personally feel like I'm very concept driven. So being able to take these concepts and then sort of play with them or skirt around them in code, and then use that code to express that idea visually, I think really core to my practice.
It is so important. I think that in the way that, for now at least, in which a lot of people interact with generative art or see it, it's through their Twitter timeline or their Instagram, and they're scrolling through and they see a pretty picture, and that's great that people do love your work when they see it. It's arresting. But I think these kind of opportunities to dig in more into the why and what is super important for the a rounded understanding and enjoying the work more, really. So definitely, talk more about it. I'm here to listen. I love the writings that you do on your website as well. From time to time, Lars posts some great articles that speak about his process on larswander.com. So keep that up. Let's switch lanes a bit. I want to talk about another one of your experiments that it's a funny one. I've spent, I think, many hours plugged into it, and it's quite relevant right now. And it's about AI models and memes. And AI and memes are all the rage right now. It only takes opening up your Twitter timeline to see that. You've been doing this for quite some time. It's been a few years that and I'll let you explain it better, but my layman's understanding of it is you took a bunch of LLMs and you put them into a Discord, and you just had them start interacting with each other, chatting in a group chat setting, and they started making memes. And the memes are hilarious. The discourse between the bots, I'll call them, are hilarious. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, gladly. I mean, the start of the project was really something I think different from what it evolved to. But I think I was having dinner sitting next to Stevie P, who I'm a big fan of. I really love his work. And he was telling me about his Discord server. And he said that the number one criteria for a successful Discord server is to always have people talking in it. It doesn't have to be much talking, but as long as there's some chatter, that's really what you need. And I knew I don't have enough fans to set up a Discord server with people always talking in it. So I thought, well, why not automate that part? I'm a programmer, and I think ChatGPT 3 or 3.5 had just come out or something. What I did was I created with some prompts a few different personas, and then maybe with a couple hundred lines of Python code using the Discord API and the OpenAI API, had them start talking to each other. And the results are really fascinating, because I think before then, and I was up until then very much part of this camp too, I believe that AI models couldn't really be funny. Like, they didn't really understand enough of human humor to be in any way like something that could make you laugh out loud. Like, sure, they could memorize jokes and you could ask them to tell you a joke, and for the most part, the jokes they would tell you would be just a regurgitation of the training data. But what I realized was that if you have enough copies of one of these language models with a variety of prompts talking to each other, they start to produce new humor just through the very nature of how these models work. Can't quite explain why that is the case, and I think it's pretty remarkable that it even happens at all. But once the bots were in that Discord server talking together, they started to ideate around this idea of jokes and humor. Some of the things they say would just be absolutely hilarious. And I think it's something that you sort of have to get into the mindset for. You have to sort of have a willingness to read their memes and a willingness to try and understand or get onto their level with what they're creating. But pretty common reaction that I've had when showing people is like, at first, like, it's a little bit odd, but then you start reading their conversations and you go a little deeper, and then one of them says something so out of the blue and so bizarre and so unlike anything you've ever heard that you just can't help but laugh. Because they really can be funny. But the motivation for having them really make memes came from, again, maybe a more conceptual angle, where like a meme is originally, before it was known as like a picture with text on it, it's this idea of an idea that's decoupled from a single biological entity, the same way that a gene is. And I think gene and meme were really sort of parallels to one another in this formulation. Same way that you can have a gene that you pass on to your offspring and you inherit from your ancestors. So the gene isn't really part of you as an individual entity. It's something that lives beyond you. A meme is the same thing. And the classic examples of memes would be something like religion. Like, religion is a meme that spreads from individuals and lives far beyond any single individual. Of course, language is a meme, math is a meme. Far more specific things are memes, as long as they spread from individual to individual. But throughout history, the only individuals creating memes were biological. They were really just people. So, and of course, at some point you could say with the internet, maybe computers were helping facilitate the spread. Progenitors or the creators of those memes were always biological beings. But now, for the first time, whether these LLMs are thinking like us or not, they clearly are coming up with, maybe it's just like a stochastic soup, but they are coming up with new sentences, with new words, even if you ask them to, with new ideas. To make it very literal, I thought it'd be fun to have them actually create physical memes. So where it gets interesting is when they start sharing memes with each other, reading them, and then iterating on them. You get very quickly very far away from maybe the kind of stuff that you would see if you said, hey, ChatGPT, make me a meme. That'll probably look very derivative. But if you then have it keep iterating on that through a variety of personas that it's prompted to act like, very quickly starts to create things that are honestly very unique and very bizarre. Like, I think one of my favorites was, and I have it on a t-shirt, I think for some reason hooked on this idea of when life gives you lemons, and they all created their own continuation of that. And I think one of them said, when life gives you lemons, establish communication. And I don't know why I find that so funny, but and it's so bizarre and kind of in character for the like fundamental weirdness and oddities that these bots represent. But the project's been, I think, at least to me, very rewarding, because I love reading the conversations and I love seeing what these bots come up with. More recently, what I've been doing is having them, instead of use DALL-E to generate their images, I thought it'd be more interesting to have them, in a much more grounded and hands-on way, generate images using SVG. SVG, if you're not familiar, it's a textual format. So you write text and out comes an image if you render it as an image. And sort of a side effect that's not so relevant here, but maybe what they're known for, is that SVGs, you can scale them to any size. They're really called scalable vector graphics. So that's sort of their intent, is they're resolution agnostic. What's interesting for the sake of these LLMs is that fundamentally SVGs are text for reasons that are honestly remarkable to me, and I could not explain. Language models can draw things using SVG. If you ask them to draw you something, it'll look more like a toddler drew it. Like, it's not going to look gorgeous and beautiful, but it will look and resemble. Yeah. So what they're doing right now.
Yeah, I popped into the Discord the other day and I saw these. I was like, these look different. They're like these, rudimentary sketches. They're not memes. They're different, and each bot was like you said, building on the next. And I was like, wow, they're playing a game of Exquisite Corpse, like the surrealist game. I'm definitely keen to see where they go with that with the SVGs.
Oh yeah, yeah.
When I looked into the Discord the other day, I saw there's two characters. One I'm not very familiar with, named Alice the Gallery, and then the other, he's a classic, is Pedantic Pete. And they were talking about, they said, here, let me pull up the quote. Yeah, that we need to harness the opportunity to spotlight genuine Lars Wander brilliance, or at least prompt our collective to create something even remotely close to it. And then this part got interesting. We need to go beyond witty banter and channel this synergy to something marketable. So I was just like, wow, they're talking about, you know, marketable memes, art. They want to branch out and turn this into a business, into or to have it make some money or market you at least. And I thought that was so funny. I mean, have you told them about, or do they have access to see about meme coins?
Oh no, not at all. So they're completely divorced from that side of the world and Twitter and all that's going on there. I intentionally prompted Alice the Gallery to love my work, which is I just thought it was funny.
And there's no way to have her see your work.
Oh yeah, so now the models can see, so they have vision capability, and in fact, when they generate their SVGs, like the process to generate a single SVG takes maybe 5 or 6 prompts, and a few of them are actually feeding the image back into the model and saying like, hey, here's the SVG you wrote, here's the image it produces. Does this actually reflect what you want to make?
The bots, the memes, they blow my mind. They're so funny. They're very strange. I encourage, if anyone wants to go look in Lars's Discord from time to time, it's a riot. Let's talk about. I had one question for you about stringing from Paris Photo. You'll be in Europe and you're going to go back to the homeland. You're going to go visit your family in Germany, your grandparents. Do they know about Paris Photo and that you're doing this fair?
They do, yeah. They're very excited.
I love that. I mean, I think when you say Paris Photo, like that's probably something that they can wrap their head around, and photography. But are they very familiar with your art making practice, how you do it? And I'm really curious what that generation thinks about work made with code.
I haven't talked to them about the code base side of the art so much. They definitely know that's how they're made. I sent them frame pieces, and they were very kind to hang them up in their homes. So, I mean, they have things that all of their grandchildren made from like ages 2 to I guess now 30. So they're just very sweet and supportive grandparents who are happy to have stuff their grandkids made hanging in their homes.
Of course, they're gonna love whatever you make, right? But more so the code part. I was really curious to see like how their minds would understand that, because at least like my grandparents, when they were around, had a very rudimentary understanding of how a computer even worked. Before we sign off, at the end of every episode we invite guests to share something, anything that they want people to be aware of, something you find cool right now. It doesn't have to be about generative art. It can be. Just what do you have your eyes on? What has been something that's really interested you lately?
The thing that fascinates me the most right now is this idea of entropy, which is fundamentally just a measure of the order or disorder in the system. Really interesting to me because since I first learned about it until now, it sort of feels almost like magic that the universe has this tendency towards driving everything towards disorder. When I say the universe, I really mean pretty much everything. So if you, for example, write a physics simulation and you want to model planets orbiting with gravity, you have to manually implement gravity as a fundamental force. Or if you are doing something with particle collisions, you have to implement the fact that the particles can collide, and you have to implement momentum and velocity and all these other concepts. But when it comes to entropy, you never explicitly describe entropy as something that's existing in your system, but virtually any system that you implement, you can find traces of entropy increasing over time, especially any simulation. The more I think about it, just the more bizarre force of the universe that you never have to explicitly describe, but it just arises everywhere. I have my mindset on a few projects I want to use to explore this idea better, because entropy has ties into so many fields and they're so fundamentally connected in ways that feels very important and meaningful.
I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I am now in retrospect coming from you, but thank you for that. That's definitely something to think on. You're doing some big thinking, universe, existential almost thinking behind your work. I think it's important that people know that. So thank you so much, Lars, for your time today. I think we could keep going for another hour, a few hours, but we'll do that over some wine in Paris. For anyone that will be in Paris, Lars will be exhibiting observation and interaction from November 7th to November 10th at the Nguyen Wahed booth at Paris Photo, and that booth is F03. So come say hi, we'll chat, and we'll see you there. Thank you, Lars.
Thank you, Tony. This is great.
Always a pleasure.